Hello, I am Linda Elder. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Gerald Nosich. Hello, Gerald.
Hi, Linda.
We are coming to you from the Foundation for Critical Thinking, which is a 501c3 nonprofit in California. Gerald's coming from one part of California and I'm coming from another. This is December 31st, 2021, the last day of the year. And we are focused on in this series on the analysis of thought, specifically focusing on the elements of reasoning, and we're going deeper. We're going deeper beyond our introductory work in critical thinking. And so we're glad that you're joining us. In this session, we're going to focus on the concept of analysis itself. And I would like to just begin by unpacking what I mean by that, and then Gerald will join in as he will. So when we think of the analysis of reasoning, we focus on what has come to be termed the elements of reasoning, or the elements of thought, or the parts of thinking. There are other ways to say it. These are the ones that we tend to use. And it's important to understand that when we talk about the analysis of thought, we're talking about analysis in exactly that sense. We're talking about analysis in relationship to reasoning. And therefore, we can ask, are there other forms of analysis that go beyond or are different from reasoning, or can be somehow separated from reasoning? So that we understand that if we're focusing on the analysis of thought, we can immediately go to the elements of reasoning. We know that we have a purpose, we're asking questions, we're using information, we're making inferences based on our assumptions and the information and where that's leading us, also informed by and oriented by our point of view, all of this leading to implications and consequences. I think I got them all. So we have 8 elements. So that's once you understand that, then you can begin to apply the elements of reasoning wherever you have reasoning. Mm-hmm. So then we ask, well, are there other uses of the term analysis that could be helpful? And do all of them somehow connect to reasoning, or just what? And so we can, so we know that if we look at a good dictionary definition of analysis, we know that it means taking apart, taking something apart, looking at the parts of something. So as I was preparing for our discussion today, I was thinking about, what other things have parts? And certain obvious things come to mind, like the parts of an engine, the parts of a tennis game, the parts of an editorial. And the parts can be thought of in general terms or in more specific terms. So it could be general patterns in the way that we write, and then there can be specific parts of how a writer writes. So suddenly I've dived in and I'm thinking, wait a minute, maybe we're asking the wrong question, because maybe we should ask, are there any things that we can talk about that don't have parts? So for instance, think of anything that you can think of around your house. So a book, okay, I've already said the writing itself has parts, and then the publishing of the book has parts, and then a cell phone has parts, and then a pen has parts, and then you have a light that has parts, and you have a scarf that has parts, and you have a human body that has parts, and you have an egg that has parts. Suddenly everything's got parts. And then so that's what sort of came to me, and I realized that I hadn't actually explored the concept of analysis before in this way. I was using the concept of analysis in these other intuitive ways, but not thinking so much about the specific point that almost everything has parts. So, Gerald, what would you like to say there?
Yeah. Let me say something about analysis, because I've been thinking about it in the last couple of days since we decided we were going to be talking about this, and thinking about it in a different, but I think deeper way than the way I used to. So whenever I talked about analysis before, it was always in terms of the parts of something. And that's because I'm geared to the elements of reasoning and the parts of reasoning that's in there. But I think actually analysis is used in two different ways. They're related, but there are two different ways. One of those is break something down into its parts. Okay. That's if I do a chemical analysis of a rock, I'm going to be enumerating the various molecules, not the atoms, but the molecules that constitute the rock. So it's a chemical analysis of a rock, and I'm figuring out its parts. So that's for inanimate natural objects. But for other things, for things that are either part of reasoning or the product of human thinking, I think that the real question analysis is trying to answer is, what's going on in this? What's going on in this situation? What's going on in this tennis game, to use your example? What's going on? And then I go through the parts as an aid to figuring out what's going on in it. If I analyze a poem, it's not as if I'm going to concentrate primarily on what are the parts of the poem. I'm going to be focusing on how does the word choice fit with the meaning? How does the meter fit with the meaning? So it's not just I'm going to be saying meter, rhyme scheme, and all those parts, but how they fit together. So that brings us naturally to the concept that we always use, and that's the logic of. So I think that the basic goal of analysis is to enlighten us as to the logic of something, to break it down, not just into parts, but parts that are relevant to the logic of something. And so what that means for me is that there's the standard, the critical thinking standard, the intellectual standard of relevance that goes all the way through all our analysis. We just don't bring it to the forefront of our mind because it's already embedded in the elements of reasoning. But you can see it. So suppose I'm analyzing my teaching. So I'm going to give you a bad example now. I'm analyzing my teaching and I'm saying, well, my purpose, one of the elements of reasoning, my purpose is to help my students think through issues in the subject matter and in their life to their best ability, using the traits of a critical thinking. That's my purpose. Now you ask me, what's an assumption I make about teaching? And I say, well, an assumption is that I'm going to be paid at the end of each month. Okay, that's an actual assumption, but notice it doesn't fit with the purpose, right? It doesn't fit with the purpose at all. And so I would say, well, I went way off track. I started on one thing. So it's not just the parts, it's the parts as interrelated to form a logic. And that gives me a deeper insight into how someone could go wrong analyzing, even using the elements of reasoning, because you could have one thing in mind when you state your assumptions. You could have something very different in mind when you state your goals or the implications and consequences. You could be on a different tack. So my thought up to this point is that there are two kinds of analysis. One is where you're breaking something down into just its parts, like the chemicals in a rock. And the other one, which involves reasoning, either straightforwardly or implicitly, is I'm breaking things down into its parts in order to illuminate the logic of something. Okay, so that's where I was, but actually I actually went a step deeper than that. Even when I'm analyzing an inanimate natural object like a rock, I'm actually using something like the logic of to guide me. So suppose I'm analyzing a rock, I break it down into its chemical elements, right? But if I were just breaking a rock down into its parts, I could say, okay, let me analyze the rock. There's a left-hand side and there's the right-hand side. When I put them together, I have the whole rock. Well, I've broken it down into its parts, but it's trivial. It's unimportant because it doesn't have a goal in mind the way that chemical analysis.
Yes.
So notice relevant threads through everything, but I mostly just take for granted that the relevance is in there, but it isn't automatically in there. Lots of times people analyze things and they go in different directions. And I can sometimes do that myself as well. So, so my conclusion, so that goes to one of the usual synonyms for calculus is analysis. A lot of people refer to calculus as analysis, but analysis really is the background theory which shows how it is that calculus works. So notice, it's not just calculating in calculus, it's also understanding why I'm able to break things down into these infinitesimally small parts. That means I'm illuminating the logic of, or think of analysis as in psychoanalysis. There I'm trying to figure out what's going on in me or with a client or something like that. I'm not just looking at the parts, I'm looking at how these parts fit together in order to illuminate what's going on and maybe what's going awry in this person's thinking or acting or feelings or something like that. Anyhow, that's my story. What do you think?
Well, that's many stories in one. So there are many ways to enter that. And now for one thing that you were doing is you were showing the many ways in which, if we understand the elements of reasoning, the elements that exist in reasoning, then we can do all kinds of things with our thinking that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do, just as a summary of what you were saying. And you gave a few examples which were very helpful. And then you pointed out that even if you can identify things that seem to be connected to just looking at the parts in terms of analysis, even then your reasoning is, I don't think you said always involved,
right?
But that's I think what I'm looking for are, let's say, opposite cases where some paradigm case of something where, yes, you can connect it to reasoning, because ultimately everything that we do connects to reasoning, because you don't stop reasoning. Your reasoning is always there. It's always trying to help you figure things out. So but what I'm thinking of is that we can command the elements of reasoning and use those well. And that's a direct way of entering a line of reasoning. And right, but then we can also enter even the elements by just looking at, say, the parts, where though the elements are there, the immediate focus is on certain parts, such as, for example, let's say let's take, if you can imagine that every complex concept, it embodies a cluster of concepts. Then I could say, well, what concepts are involved with or entailed in the concept of love? Then you're going to have to give me, I'm going to say, I want constellations, but I want there to be the center to be the core idea. And then I want you to come out from that with other important ideas, all of which interconnect. And if I and so one could be respect, and one is consideration for the individual growth of the other person, and you could name other concepts. So in this point, we're not saying, well, we need all the elements of reasoning. Now we need your purpose, you need your question, no, I'm saying I'm not focusing like that right now. I'm saying, give me the concepts that you think are involved in this other concept, which is the core concept. And when you do that, you're using the term analysis in a slightly different way, because you're saying, no, I want to analyze it from this perspective. So let me give you another example. So if you are analyzing a book that you may want to read, let us say Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. Now this is structured in a certain way, I'm presuming. So one thing I can do is I can open this up and I can look for the table of contents. And I can look at this book in accordance with that table of contents, thinking of each part as one of the parts of the whole. So that's why I think we want to explore, we of course want to explore and are exploring more deeply in this series, the elements of reasoning. Right. But before we do, I want to step back from that and ask, well, are we first clear about the different primary forms of analysis? And you've named the two, I think, primary forms that will encompass others as well. And so you're either looking at the parts of something, or you're looking at the parts of reasoning that may have created the something. So for example, let's take an engine. You can look at the parts of an engine. You can say, look, I don't want to hear about the elements of reasoning right now. I just want to know, tell me what the parts of the engine are. Well, the parts of the engine are in another set of questions. So really you're asking, what is entailed in an engine? And that's a question you're asking. And I'm going to give you my inferences based on the information. So I didn't get away from elements of reasoning. I just proved your point. But in any case, I could say, yes, okay, I get that. But now just name the parts. Just look at this engine and name the parts. So if I say that, I'm asking you to focus on one element of reasoning, I suppose, which is, what is the information? But I'm saying that in certain cases, we don't have to enter at the elements of reasoning as a whole. We can enter at any place. I can say, look, what are the parts of this book? And somebody says, wait a minute, first let's do the logic of it. I'm saying, well, what do you mean? I want to know the parts of this book. I want somebody to tell me what is in here. And so one, freedom, a psychological problem, question mark. Well, so that tells me that he's basically saying that we've got a psychological problem with freedom. That's section 1. So that's the first part. So what I'm saying is the term analysis is actually very rich as I begin to explore just thinking about the element, the term analysis in terms of the parts.
Right.
And so I want to just explore that a little bit, and then we'll move to, if we could, back to the elements of reasoning as a whole and just talk a little bit about them. But focusing on first, whether there are other things that we need to explore on this question of analysis. And I have a few notes here I was looking at. Did you want to comment?
Yeah, I guess I would say two things. One is, everything you're saying is quite in accord with how I think about it and how I usually talk about it. But I'd say, think about the parts of the engine of a car. If you tell me the parts of the engine of the car, I'm thinking that you don't literally mean only that. What you mean, already there's a logic going on underneath the surface. What you mean is the interconnected parts given the purpose of an engine, right? I mean, if you say, here are the two parts, again, my crude analogy, There's the left-hand side and there's the right-hand side. Those are parts, but it doesn't help at all. So we're looking for interconnected parts given the purpose of an engine. Now that's for human artifacts, things that people
Yes.
make. But with things that people haven't made, I'd say we always have to distinguish between the parts of the thing and the parts of our thinking about the thing.
Yes.
Right. And to me, those interchange in my mind very, very easily. I mean, I don't know if I remember my physics well enough, but there are some, I think quarks don't have parts. But my thinking about quarks certainly has parts. It's maybe the smallest building block of anything. So, but if I think of, but for everything else, the thing itself may have parts or will have parts, but my thinking about those parts will have the elements of reasoning as essential components in how I'm understanding it. So when I said before about the chemical analysis of the rock, we do that way because we have the systematic, well-reasoned theory of chemistry to guide us to know what to look for in the rock that's relevant to our chemical analysis, if that makes sense. That's pretty abstract, but 400 years ago, they'd have looked at a rock and looked at what about it can turn lead into gold. I mean, they'd look for things that aren't in fact there. So we're guided by our thinking.
Yeah, so when we bring in natural things like, say, take a leaf.
Right.
So a leaf has certain parts.
Right. Right.
But the parts, we're trying to understand the parts.
Yeah.
And we may have imperfect knowledge of the parts and how the parts relate to the whole. So there, again, we have the term function in relationship to purpose is useful, right? So, and then so relating this to the elements of reasoning, we can say the leaf has a purpose, and you could stretch around the wheel, but meaning that you could say, you know, like, is the leaf is asking a question. Well, no, the leaf is not really asking a question, but it's pursuing a path based on its what it knows to do. Now it all breaks down. So in any case, but there are parts, and now, of course, we have to understand the parts through our own reasoning.
Right.
So again, we can't escape reasoning. And I'm not trying to escape reasoning, because that wouldn't make sense, because we understand a leaf through reasoning or any other object. But what I am saying is that we should explore, meaning all of us, uses of the term analysis that aren't necessarily entering directly through the elements of reasoning. Maybe that's a better way of saying it.
Oh.
So we're entering through, let's say that we looked at this book again, Eric Fromm's Escape from Freedom, and we're looking at the table of contents. So when I start to look at this, I'm saying, I want to analyze what's here. I want to take apart what's here. Or see what the parts entail. So you see, again, of course, reasoning is involved in this, because I'm going to see key concepts. I'm going to see questions he's asking. He's asking a question right away. So that's freedom. A psychological problem? That's a question right away. So, and probably everything in the book is going to be trying to answer that question, I'm guessing, based on this analysis. So I'm saying we should explore using the term analysis in different ways. And I mean, in this, I don't want to say more general way, but in this different use.
Yeah. And so I don't know if this is actually addressing the point you're making, but I would say that the elements of reasoning are involved in everything that involves trying to think things through. Not, I don't mean explicitly involved, like to identify my assumptions, but they're involved in all the thinking. So certainly they're going to be in Fromm's book, and I can use that to guide my way through it. Or they're going to be, if you look at this painting behind me, I can't quite point over here. I mean, the elements of reasoning are involved in all of that. I can ask, what's Vermeer's goal in doing this, right? What information did he have about how light comes through? What assumptions is he making about how to paint it, and so forth? So that's to me, that's the primary meaning of the word analysis, is the logic of, in terms of the 8 elements. So
Well, I see that, but I do think if someone were to ask the question, what is the difference between analysis and analysis of thought? We have to have some uses that aren't just breaking down to the elements of reason. And that's my point. So yes, they relate, and they relate very quickly, but
right.
there are other ways to use the term. And for example, again, back to my example of love. So if I said, let's just focus on the key concepts in love, you could say, well, Linda, that's the elements of reasoning, because you have an implicit question there. And I can say, yes, that's true, but I'm focusing right now over here just on concepts. And yes, they're all connected, but I don't have to connect them all the time. And we don't. We enter at a certain point and we begin to analyze in that scenario. And maybe that also illuminates the fact that we need to make more explicit moves related to the elements of reasoning. In other words, if I were to say, okay, let me just pick this up and let me analyze this book. Let me analyze the table of contents. Well, if I immediately bring in the elements into my mind and say, well, don't remember not to do this without the elements of reasoning. Mm-hmm. You could say, but anyway, it's interesting exploration, just thinking about the concept of analysis and how it's probably, I believe it's probably more like this. You're in the elements of reasoning somewhere, but you may be highlighting again one of the elements, and so it seems like the others aren't there, but they are there. So you're just focusing on the information right now, for example.
Right. So go ahead. Sorry.
Just making that explicit in the mind when it's happening, and saying, so let's just say somebody says, well, let's discuss your concept of love. So the question and issue is, what is my concept of love? And what are the concepts embedded in that?
Right.
Well, they asked me to go straight to concepts. They didn't tell me I could explore, well, they didn't say what information has led you, before you answer that, Linda, what information has led you to these conclusions? See what I mean? So now what are you assuming right now, Linda, before you don't write your answer? See, so you're more or less focusing in one of the elements. Maybe that's a more accurate way of saying it, that as you're going through life, you may be, if you're explicitly trying to bring critical thinking into your life, then you are noticing the elements of your reasoning.
Right.
Which.
Right. So if I think about analysis, kind of independent of the explicit use of the elements of reasoning, there were plenty of great literary analysts who would analyze the Hamlet in Shakespeare's play, and who did it without ever mentioning any of the elements of reasoning, and without probably even in their own mind enunciating, well, this is an assumption I'm making, or this is an assumption that I think Hamlet is making. So they're not bringing in their purpose. They might be bringing in the information, but even it's just minor. I mean, this is something that happens in the play, might be a piece of information. So it's clear to me that you could analyze something without explicitly using the terms for the elements of reasoning, and without actually having the elements of reasoning explicitly in your mind. But what makes critical thinking so forceful and so workable is that having those explicitly in my mind leads me one way, in directions I wouldn't ordinarily go. So I'm saying this stuff, it's 1900, I'm analyzing Hamlet. If I ask myself, so what assumptions am I making about Hamlet's character? That's going to lead me to maybe discoveries, things that I could explore that I wouldn't explore if I just let my mind go in its usual pattern. But my impression is that we tend towards certain elements in our lives in certain situations, and even maybe overall, we tend toward certain of the elements, and even more pointedly, tend away from others. For instance, concepts is, I believe, one of the ones that people often don't reflect on very much at all. I'm luckily in this respect, I have a philosophy background where almost the entire focus is on concepts, but people will blithely talk about democracy or freedom or rights without ever wondering what democracy, freedom, or rights are. So we don't automatically explore those concepts. But if I've got the concept of concept, if I've got that element explicitly in my mind, it stops my discussion for a moment. It makes me take that reflective step back. And now I think, okay, so I'm wondering if this country is using full democracy or not. And now I have to analyze my concept of what democracy is. So what I'm saying is that I can analyze something without explicit use of the elements of reasoning, though of course they're there underneath. But that in addition, having the elements explicitly in front of me as conscious tools just greatly amplifies the perceptiveness of my analysis.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's clear that there have been historically and always will be people who use the elements of reasoning very well, and especially in certain areas of their lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's clear, because
Mm-hmm.
anywhere you see accomplishment, you're going to see that. And anywhere you see the best thinking, you're going to see that, whether it's political thinking or scientific thinking or any other type of thinking. So that's clear, but that doesn't help the rest, so to speak. In other words, that's well and good, but then how do we emulate, people like Seneca and Socrates?
Mm-hmm.
How do we emulate these best thinkers? And this is where the elements of reasoning come in, and of course, importantly, the intellectual standards and the intellectual virtues in connection. But notice that move that I'm making there. So that's another example of what I mean, where we're looking at the parts of something, but we're not focusing on the elements of reasoning per se. So for example, we could say in our approach, in our framework for critical thinking, we have certain core concepts that are themselves complex. Mm-hmm. And we have the elements of reasoning, one part, intellectual standards, another part, intellectual virtues, another part, and barriers, another part. And I would say there are other core moves, such as the relationship between cognition and affect, which we don't tend to place core, but we really should, so that people see right away there's an emotional dimension. We're not leaving that. We're not talking about cold logic. And so in any case, we had these core concepts, and we can talk about how these core concepts interrelate without ever talking about our question, our information, and so forth. And if we're thinking, well, then we don't need to have done that. That's my point. We don't always need to focus on all of the elements. And though they're always there, whenever there is reasoning, we may be using the term, again, analysis, to focus in on certain types of analysis. And of course, again, that requires, I see that you can't ever get out of the box of reasoning. It's just every move I make, I'm seeing that I'm in this room and the door's closed. So we've got the reasoning is occurring. So I think we've basically we could continue to explore the different ways in which analysis could be used. For example, this is a good one, I think, because it's messy, and that's what I'm looking for a bit. So the analysis of a poem, you've already mentioned that. So when we analyze a poem, there are different rules that apply from when you're analyzing really any other written piece. And you could say also, if you're reading a love letter, that different rules apply. But just say, right? So there are going to be special standards that apply. But so we, what was that? I lost my train of thought there. So what was
analyzing a poem?
So thank you, analyzing a poem. So when we're analyzing a poem, we're not necessarily trying to figure out what the author meant so much as what is a powerful interpretation here. And then we're not looking for a definitive way of defining a word that was used. We're not asking for accuracy there. We're looking for some kind of something that's a little ambiguous. So we don't ask the author, did you mean this or did you mean that?
Right.
The author will say, well, what did you think it, right? So that means, so if we're analyzing a poem, then we have different parameters from, let's say, the usual way of thinking about the elements of reasoning in relationship to writing, where you're conveying important meaning. So, so what are the parts? What are the parts of a good poem, for example? So one of the parts would be to have, there'll have to be a certain use of language that draws the reader in and allows for different meanings that are equally powerful, something like that. And so we could continue, thinking about what would be involved in the parts.
Right.
But of course, all of it relates to the elements of reason. I see that. But if we only allow use of the term analysis to relate to the elements of reasoning, then I think that's an error. And that's what I'm trying to illuminate.
Okay, so let me say something. I actually was going to say something about the poetry example, but let me say, I heard you say that people have engaged in very profound thinking and not necessarily focus on all the elements of reasoning. They can focus on this one or this set and not necessarily be focusing on all of them. And that seems clearly true when I think of people of great thinkers in history. I would say, in addition, though, I'm going to use the word always, but I'm going to be willing to take it back in a moment. Though it's not necessary to think in terms of all the elements, I'm going to say it's always helpful to do so. I don't really mean the always there. Let me say it's virtually always helpful. So I may have thought through something very well, focusing on this or that element or this set of elements explicitly or not. But then if I step back and ask myself, okay, so what are some further implications of this?
Mhm.
I've already done all my thinking. That's helpful. I don't mean it always gives me a new answer, but it sends my thinking off in a direction that I haven't thought it through. Or how can I look at this from a different point of view? Even if I think about something as technical as quantum mechanics, oftentimes the objections that one great physicist will raise to another are objections that the first person, that Einstein, who always raised objections to quantum mechanics, that he could have thought of those objections that were made to him if he thought about the implications of what he was saying. That is, if he consciously stepped back and said, okay, so I'm saying this as an objection to quantum mechanics, what are the implications of it?
Mhm.
Now, those implications came out when Niels Bohr then objected. So I'm saying that though you don't have to focus on all the elements, of course not, it's nearly always helpful to do so. And I think that's one of the great blessings of the elements of reasoning. It's one of the
Mhm.
great advantages it gives me. So when I work on critical writing, for instance, I imagine a student who's finished the whole paper, complete A+ paper, very good paper, and then she asks herself, how can I make this even better? Well, a good way to do that is to ask about the elements or about the standards, right? I can say, okay, so what other assumptions am I making in this paper? It's complete, it's a very fine, it's a nice paper. What are some further implications of it? What are some other points of view? So I'm thinking of the elements as always or nearly always helpful.
Yes, I believe that when I was talking about people who reason well,
Mhm.
I believe I said that they are frequently not aware of
Mhm.
the elements of reasoning.
Right.
And it would be interesting to know, let's say, take a book by Jane Austen.
Mhm.
Would that book have been better if she had been explicitly aware of the elements of reasoning? So I
Uh,
think there are some cases where the person really does have command of the elements, but
mhm.
she's not calling them that yet.
Right. Right.
So in other words, she's very aware that people make inferences that don't make sense.
Right.
She's very aware that people bring in information that's irrelevant. And she's saying that, no, of course. But so in a given era, some degree of critical thinking skills may be explicitly taught or along with other things in pieces, right? So this is very complex.
Right.
And it's important to remember that, of course, the elements of reasoning have come to us through history. That is, we've always been engaging in the elements of reasoning.
Right.
Is that Richard figured out how to capture it,
Mhm.
to bring it down to the most foundational concepts. I think that's correct
Right.
to say. So, and so people have been doing this, and they've also been explicitly discussing that they were doing it.
Mhm.
So eventually, though, but that's going to be coming to us in a very scattered way through history. That's just my reading of how the language is developing. So in any case, now we have this ability to be very aware, and I think it would be interesting to go through a week where every time you thought something, you made yourself connected to the elements. Just every time you think something. Now, how is that relating to the elements of reason? So that's an inference. Could be very superficial. You can say, well, God, that would sort of be exhausting. So if you're cooking dinner and you think, okay, what do I want to eat? Well, that's your question at issue.
Mhm, mhm,
And so you're doing that. And then what are my options? That's the information.
mhm.
And then you begin to make inferences.
Right.
And
For sure. Yeah. Mhm,
right. And so if you're eating from your house, whatever is in your house, then the information is right there. It's whatever you've got. It's the actual ingredients. And then although you can then make inferences based on those ingredients, but some people make better inferences there.
right.
And right. So some people only think of one way to cook and they cook the same way every day. And other
Mhm,
people have all kinds of spices and know how to use them and make everything taste different, even if it's the same thing. You see what I
mhm,
mean?
mhm.
So I guess what I'm saying is if you stopped yourself every time, then I think, and if you were able to do that, I think by implication, you would start to see all kinds of mistakes you're making. And for example, not seeing the move that I just made about ingredients. I mean, I might tonight, just because of this conversation, I might say, I'm not going to cook the same way I always have. That was an actual personal example that rolled right off the tongue. So maybe I'm going to, use some different spices. So just by stopping and saying, what inferences am I making based on what I have?
Mhm.
And so it's so you can get locked into, even in on a daily basis, these everyday decisions you can sort of get caught in little ruts. That's what I mean. And when you stop and look at everything you're doing from the elements, maybe that would illuminate what the problems in your thinking, or begin to.
Well, let me say, in relation to your cooking example, I just related it to the Jane Austen example you used earlier, and that is, if she had consciously worked through the elements of reasoning, would her novels have been better? And it brings up a question that I don't have an answer to, but often I think about. I don't think it would have made her novels better. In fact, here's the question. I think it may have made her novels worse.
I was afraid you might say that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if she questioned, is marrying somebody with a fortune the very best way of going about finding someone to marry? I'm guessing that, I don't know that idea occurred to her or didn't occur to her, but there's a way in which, if she dwelled on that very much, she's going to lose one of her basic ideas for a novel, or lose some impact in it. And similarly, the thing about cooking, well, my example is always, if you're playing baseball, you're a professional baseball player, and there's something going wrong with your swing and you're not hitting, it's probably not the best idea to dwell thoughtfully about your swing while you're swinging the bat. That's going to distract you from the motion of the bat that you had before. It's often very good to ask a coach who can observe you from the outside, but even that is at a later time. So I'm thinking that if I think too much about my cooking, I can spoil the soup. So,
Well, I think those were two different kinds of examples, though, because one is so one is in the actually, if
right.
I could just
Baseball is different. Okay.
well, one is in the moment. So
Yeah.
I was using,
Right.
let's say, a sports analysis.
Yeah.
Let's say you're a tennis player and you've played the game as well as you possibly can for that day.
Mhm.
And now you're watching the video of your performance. So you're analyzing
Right.
your performance.
Mhm.
Now, the question at issue is clear. How can I use this information to improve my game?
Mhm.
Presumably, right? Because that's what, unless I'm being made to view it, presumably I'm using this to become better at tennis. So we can enter right there with the elements of reasoning. My purpose is to be the best player that I can. And so this viewing, I'm analyzing the video, but I'm actually analyzing the data. I'm analyzing the information. I'm analyzing how I performed in the game. And so I'm analyzing from certain special standards. I'm looking at, did I move to the ball in time? Did I follow through on the stroke? Did I keep my eye on the ball? So I'm looking at the parts from that point of view. And that also illuminates how the analysis, the term analysis, should be used, thought of in this richer sense. So if I'm analyzing it, I am involved in the elements of reasoning. I'm reasoning. This is information. So I should know that. And of course, it's really among the best information. It's what I should spend the most time on from one perspective, so I can actually see what I'm doing wrong in order to improve myself. So, and of course, there are other kinds of information. I would watch other videos of very good players, right? And I'm going to learn information I learned from my coach. But right now, I'm going to really focus on what my weaknesses are, and I can really see it. All right, so that would be an example of analyzing the information.
Right.
And of course, I'm going to have to come to conclusions. So there's an inference. So, and that's based on, again, assumptions. The assumption that this is good information. Well, it's, unless somebody has replaced me for someone else, it's accurate. So I can count on it. And you see, so, and I can decide how far into these elements I need to go.
Right, right. Very important. Yeah. Yes.
So, and I want to say, if I could, just very quickly about Jane Austen, especially given the example that you gave. I believe that Jane Austen was a very good thinker, and that she did make a lot of the moves that she would have made if she had the explicit theory of critical thinking. So she was asking, does it really make sense to be sort of just on the marriage circuit? And she herself was not. She never married.
Right.
And but she seems to have been, really trying to examine what that looked like from her worldview that she could see. And she also was very aware of her narrow perspective, meaning that she knew certain things, but that's all she knew, because that was the only world that she lived in. And so she told, for example, I believe her nephew or her niece, who was writing a piece, began to write a novel, and she wrote back and said, I can see that from what you've written, that you've never been in these places. So don't write about what you've never experienced. So I believe that she had those understandings. And I think one way that I look at this is that if you're at the top of, let's say, the human game thus far in your field, then you're probably at the top of what we're capable of. You're at least up there, in the top X percent, whatever that percentage is. And but that doesn't mean that you are also thinking that well in any other domain of your life. And that has to be remembered. We have to be reminded of that. So each of us is going to think better in certain areas of our lives than in other areas. We're not going to be spectacular across all the domains of our lives. It's an impossibility. You're going to be what A+ as being an economic thinker. So because you have to be an economic thinker. You're going to be an A+ as a parent. You're going to be an A+ as an intimate partner, according to the other person, not you.
Right.
You're going to be A+ as an employee, according to your employers, not you. You're going to be an A+ as a colleague, according to them, not, you see what I mean? So no one can achieve that. Therefore, where we're not achieving is often where we need the elements of reasoning even more. Not to say that we can't use them even at the highest level. So I don't want to imply that either.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. And in, in a way, it just brings to mind how you might say someone say um, a, a, a husband who focuses all his energy just on work and neglects his family. One way of reading that is to say, well, his family is just not as important to him as work. And there may be very well be a lot of truth in it, but it also seems that that's could be a very facile reading of what's going on. It can be that the idea of doing what's good for my family and me in relation to my family just doesn't occupy the forefront of this guy's mind. And it could, if he stepped back and reflected on his life and what was really important to him, but he may never do so. And if he does step back and say, well, what's really important in my life, and comes to the conclusion that his family is very, very important, maybe more important than his performance at work, the elements of reasoning that are going to help him a great deal. He's going to ask, well, what questions should I be asking? What assumptions do I make about my family? So that is, I'm responding to the part about how the elements can really help in aspects of my life where I'm not very adept. And it may be that that just hasn't come to the forefront of my mind in the way that it really could.
Yes. So I think I want to say one other thing that I think is relevant here, and that is our work, our framework definitely directly goes back to Socratic thinking. And of course, there were historical markers before Socrates as well, but we can start with Socrates as a convenient place, and given the depth of his knowledge. And it seems that Socrates was trying for something like the elements of reasoning, because he was focusing first and foremost, I think, in terms of the elements, on concepts.
So, yeah.
Right. So you'd say, let's take this concept. But he also talked about following out the implications of your thinking.
Indeed, yeah.
And you can take the Socratic dialogues and you can find connectors to all of the elements of reasoning, but some of them come up more than others of them. And so in any case, that's where we begin to see some explicit work in terms of the theory of the elements. I guess I'm moving a bit, just thinking about the theory of the elements now, and the power in the elements of reasoning, and moving away from just thinking about analysis itself, although we could explore many other ways in which we could use the term analysis. But in terms of the elements of reasoning, so you get, in the development of the theory, you really get beginning there at Socrates, a beginning focus on, again, some of the elements of reasoning, and then we can bring in intellectual standards and virtues as well there with Socrates. But then after Socrates, in terms of theory of critical thinking based in natural languages, as we insist that it needs to be, this theory of critical thinking doesn't really begin to emerge again until the 20th century. So we get some movement, we get some concepts. Of course, the concepts are beginning to build, but in terms of coming up with a cohesive set of ideas that you can call your toolbox of critical thinking, that's emerging in the 20th century.
Right. And I would say even with Socrates, I mean, we don't have very much legitimately by him, but I'm not aware of anything where he addressed a question like, what is our toolbox for thinking? He used critical thinking in a magisterial way, but work on the toolbox, except maybe in bits and pieces. And you've explicated a lot of this in your encyclopedia article. There'd be parts here and parts there that would be illuminated.
Mhm.
But I think it's not until the 20th century that anybody focused extensively on the theory of critical thinking, or how does one think through something critically or think through something well.
Right. And then as the theory began to emerge, it was emerging more in terms of essay and in terms of explicit, quote, skills and abilities,
Right.
than it was emerging as a cohesive
Yes.
set of intellectual tools, which is really Richard's primary contribution.
Yeah.
Taking this knowledge again and boiling it down to something that's really manageable, and that if we were to take it seriously,
Mm-hmm.
it would be revolutionary.
Right. Yeah. That skills model, I mean, there's of course a great deal of truth in it. That is, that critical thinking involves higher order thinking skills, obviously, but there's also something insidious about it, in that it leads to that belief that people who think well, but in a nasty way, or in an underhanded way, or a self-centered way, are engaged in full-fledged critical thinking. They're engaged in a variety of critical thinking. I mean, Richard's famous distinction, weak sense versus strong sense. An example I used 2 days ago in my webinar on fairmindedness was about something that's brilliant, but again, insidious. The guy who worked for I think it's Jif peanut butter, who invented the dimple in the bottom of the jar, so that it looks exactly the same size, but it has 1/3 less peanut butter in it, so that you look at the jar and you think, oh, it's the same size jar, but there's this dimple on the bottom that presses the peanut butter up so it's got less in it. So, I mean, that's got, I don't want to say great, it's got major ingenuity in it, but there's something unlikable about it. It's meant to deceive. And that you can get by an emphasis on skills alone, and also by, you can even see it in the way I described it, a kind of impressiveness of the use of the skills all alone. I'm kind of impressed by this guy who did it with the peanut butter jar, who came up with this idea for the peanut butter jar. And I almost wish I wasn't impressed by it.
Yes. So yeah, that's well, of course, that's I believe that would fall under the category of sophistic thinking.
Indeed.
And that was the problem, one of the big problems that Socrates could see as well. Sophistry in human thinking, in human life. And we still see it rampant. We always have seen it rampant, but it hasn't quite destroyed us yet. I would like to just talk for a minute, explore for a few minutes the term synthesis.
All right.
Relationship to analysis. So because we often hear terms like analyze and synthesize, and then I'll add, just to be adding a few more, compare and contrast. And so analyze is often used in this more impoverished way. In other words, if you don't have the elements of reasoning, you're analyzing, then I'm not going to say there are going to be problems, but I'm going to say there very well may be, depending on how well you're doing that. And if you're doing it well, then you're using the elements of reasoning well. So in any case, but we tend to people tend to throw away the term, throw around the term analysis, and throw around the term, especially in education, synthesize and compare and contrast and others like that. So to synthesize, well, how would you like to?
Yeah, I can say something.
I can see that you're ready.
Maybe a little disparaging about it. I mean, I think that without the elements of reasoning, analysis just becomes this amorphous, ambiguous, ill-defined term. I mean, you look inside something, but the elements refine what is meant by analysis to an appreciable degree. I don't know of a way of making synthesis well defined. I see synthesis, the idea of bringing things together, synthesis, is what I said about analysis without the elements. That is, it's an amorphous term, and it's really not well defined. So there's a way in which I don't know quite exactly what to do in order to synthesize something. There is no synthesis analog for the elements of bringing it together. To me, the big contrast is between, you and I have talked about this a lot, is between analysis and evaluation, or analysis and assessment, right? In analysis, I'm trying to tell what's going on in Eric Fromm's book. When I evaluate it, I'm going to be asking myself, does this make sense? Does this seem accurate and clear and to the point and deep enough? So when I'm evaluating, I'm doing something very different from analyzing. Whereas if I think of, whereas I don't see that a good contrast between analysis and synthesis, except in a vague overall way.
Yes, and the definitions that I'm looking at here at dictionary.com are also not very helpful. The combining of the constituent elements of separate material or abstract entities into a single or unified entity, opposed to analysis. The separating of any material abstract entity into its constituent elements, which is strange because that actually means analysis. And then the second, a complex whole formed by combining.
Right.
And so that doesn't say, it doesn't use the term integrating. Did you notice?
Right.
So it seems that synthesis often, to really be powerful, would need to embody or entail this integration of ideas. So maybe, but it's helpful, because when terms are thrown around and yet we go, yeah, I know what you mean. Well, what do you mean by synthesis right now? How are you using that? And actually, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone use that outside of the classroom.
It's right. Right. You can do a chemical analysis of a rock, but you can't do a chemical synthesis of a rock. Or
right. Well, there are certain, like there are some other examples here. Chemistry has an example, philosophy, biology, psychology. And by the way, psychology, the integration of traits, attitudes, and impulses to create a total personality. So now they've added the term integration in a special, to use the term synthesis in a special way in the field, in the two fields. So, but I was thinking you could, if you, so now I can use the term integration because they have. So now if integration is included, then I can say, for example, I'm working on this book on critical thinking therapy. Right. So in doing this, I'm synthesizing a lot of different ideas about the human mind. And I'm also critiquing and leaving out certain theories that often are included. And so, but in any case, in the end, I have an integration, hopefully, of the ideas that I am pulling into this theory. And so if you think of synthesis that way, then it's very useful, because often people don't have that ability. They don't have those abilities to pull ideas together and show how they interrelate.
Right. Yeah. So as you were speaking, I was writing down some notes for myself. I think a way of thinking about it, maybe even a better way of saying synthesis, is to say it's organizing and showing the interconnections of things, which is another way of saying integrating. So when you're writing your book on therapy, you're organizing a great number of different approaches to therapy, and you're bringing them together into a coherent whole. But there's almost something misleading about the way of putting it. You're organizing it. You're showing how they interrelate and how this part works better than this other part. So there's a lot going on there. So that might be my take on what synthesis is. Now, in really strictly defined fields, somehow or other, physics examples are coming to my mind today. It's so a major problem in theoretical physics is that relativity theory applies to really big things, quantum mechanics applies to really small things, and the two sides don't fit together. So for the last 30 years or so, people have been working on synthesizing, on integrating those two. And it's called the theory of everything, not a very happy title, but what they're looking for is a mathematical or physical structure which will allow these two to work together. Because as it is, they seem to contradict one another, which is frowned upon. So that's, but notice this is a very strict field, well-defined field where we're going to know what's going to count as how they fit together if we have a mathematical physical account of how they fit together. But most fields don't have anything like that, some overriding model for how to tell if you've done it.
So I think the word that, let's say, I tend to use for where someone might use the term synthesis, I would tend to use in my work integration, because that seems more specific to the kind of synthesis I'm doing.
Indeed, I think so. Right.
So, but I think it's helpful I always enjoy just talking about ideas like synthesis, words that, they've been thrown around and you've used them here or there, maybe not. And not a lot of discussion, and maybe it's not even that helpful a concept, but at least you've discussed it, and so you know that its uses, what it will do for you, what it will not do for you. There's a better word for your purpose. And just to, before we leave that, I mentioned, compare and contrast. Those are also, sort of thrown in, especially in schooling circles, K-12. And compare and contrast is, these two terms, in and of themselves and by themselves, are not very interesting, because we do it constantly. You compare this person to that person. This person is someone I like, this person I can't stand. And you contrast it with what you already believe, you contrast what they believe with what you believe. So we're constantly comparing and contrasting people, ideas, food. The question is, what standards do you use when you compare and contrast? And that's it would probably just do to wait for a later discussion on intellectual standards to go further with that. So
it also it bothers me that Bloom's taxonomy and the education that takes its stance on critical thinking, based more or less on Bloom's taxonomy, the older or the newer version, uses those words as keystones, because they're so malleable as terms. They're so interwoven, and people even think of it as a hierarchy, that first you do this and then you do this and then you do that, and of course that doesn't work. It is, so if I think about critical thinking kind of in the abstract, there's a person who is thinking about an issue, right? Person, issue, and the person has certain characteristics, meaning I'm thinking of the traits of mind, the intellectual virtues or the lack thereof. There are certain traits that characterizes the person, and there are certain things that get in the way, the barriers. But in the middle between the person and the object are those words in Bloom's taxonomy. right? I mean, the person analyzes an issue or tries to synthesize an issue or organizes or integrates it. And we haven't done much work in there, not much at all. But I think it's partly because what goes on in the middle is so variable. That is, as far as I know, there isn't a good coherent account of what the mind does when it applies reasoning to the object. In the sense of compare and contrast or synthesize or analyze.
Right.
Analyze and evaluate I've got, but the rest I lose some control of. Comprehend. Yeah.
Well, if we were to teach the terms compare and contrast in connection with intellectual standards, then if we were to help people see that you're continually comparing and contrasting, or let's say routinely throughout life. The question is, how well are you doing it?
Right.
And if I'm just comparing my ideas to if I'm comparing myself to someone else, first thing I could ask is, why are you even doing that?
Right.
And so you see, it's the deeper questions that we miss. Is it, we give students a circle and say, compare and contrast. What do you mean?
And I would say that article we wrote about Richard for inquiry. I mean, the idea just came to me then, is that what you just said applies to all of Bloom's taxonomy and all those terms. There are no standards for whether you're comprehending something well. Are you comprehending it accurately, clearly, as precisely as necessary, with all its complexities? So is that take any of the terms for Bloom's taxonomy or any other such taxonomy, and what's left out noticeably is the standards. Yet the standards are in a major way what makes critical thinking, right? So if you leave those out, there's a way in which you're not doing much. And when they leave them out, they just take them for granted. They say, like, make inferences. Well, I mean, we're always making inferences.
I was looking up as you were talking, the 6 levels: remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So, for example, and Richard does a critique of this in his anthology. And anyone who's interested should look at that. So let me just say one other thing, if I could, one other example on the importance of taking the elements of reasoning more seriously, and in terms of their application in all fields of study. I'll take one example, and we could go into any field and find similar examples. You mentioned literary critique earlier, and so it's like an analysis, right? So that's sort of implied. And often literary critique is done by people who are living in a kind of special language where they're using certain concepts to guide their critique, such as tone and plot, and there are others that are mainly, to me, uninteresting, and in comparison with the elements of reasoning.
Oh, I see.
For example, take Jane Austen. She's often been criticized as being sort of trivial and only focused on manners. And anyone who thinks that really is not reading Jane Austen very well, because she is getting deeply into the pathologies of human thinking, and she's exploring those. And if you're missing that, then as a person giving your critique, because you're focused on your own special language, your own special way of analyzing, according to your school of thought, or the way that your colleagues do it, or the way we've decided and written textbooks on it to do it. Not very well said, but you get the idea. So if we critique the critiques, we're often going to see a lack of understanding of the elements of reasoning and their power. So if I analyze a Jane Austen novel from the point of view of the logic of any of the, let's say, main or important characters. And so I can do the logic of every important character, and I can do the logic of Jane Austen's thinking herself. That is what I infer is her reasoning based on this book. And so I guess that's one thing I wanted to point out, that when you have the elements very well in hand, then your critique shows that. And you stick with ordinary language in critique. And if you take, you can take another field, like, again, going back to critical thinking therapy, or let's just take the field of mental health therapy, mental health therapies. So there are very many schools of thought to choose from in terms of mental health methodologies, and they're better and worse. And you need the elements of reasoning and intellectual standards to be able to make sense of all of this. And then, if you will, to synthesize it. So you need those tools to be able to figure out what is even going on in this terrain, in this intellectual terrain. And that's a good example, because there are so many different theories of mind.
Right.
Coming mainly from psychology in terms of mental health therapies.
Right.
That you have to think very well to be able to critique them.
Right.
That means you have to understand the purposes of the theorists themselves, the way they're using information, the questions they're asking, the interpretations that they're coming to, etc. So we can go into any field, and we do this regularly to discuss the importance of the elements of reasoning. I just want to mention a couple of examples as we bring this to a close, of how important the elements are in thinking within every field of study.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It seems very clear that they're always enriching, or nearly always enriching. I always have to stick that nearly in.
Now when we have the elements of reasoning, when we understand our purpose, our questions, our information that we're using, that we need to use. Now, right there, I brought in the intellectual standard. Intellectual standards, but I wasn't intending to. So in other words, we can take apart the elements, but without the intellectual standards, we don't yet have critical thinking. We only have the thinking. We only have the reasoning. So if we take the term critical thinking to mean critical reasoning, then the reasoning entails 8 elements, but we still don't have the critical part.
Right.
So we've still got to have, and you and I are continually implying intellectual standards.
Right, indeed.
So the justifiability of your purpose, the clarity of your question, and the precision of your question, and so forth. So we should never teach the elements of reasoning without intellectual standards.
Right.
And we should, when we're talking about elements of reasoning, and we're saying that we talk about the power in opening up the elements, well, you open it up and then you apply intellectual standards to it. That's the way that I think of it.
Right.
So but we have to remember that we've got to apply those intellectual standards to the parts in the circle.
Right. And one other thing that's related that I want to mention, and that's, and I know you already that you agree with this, of course, it's that if I've analyzed some issue or some aspect of my life by carefully going around the circle of elements, identifying my assumptions, the implications and consequences, going all the way around, it doesn't mean I'm done. It doesn't mean I'm done. That is, and even if I do it in accord with most of the standards, if I do it in accord with all the standards we normally list, except for depth and comprehensiveness, right? Then I can still have analyzed it accurately, clearly, precisely, fairly, and so forth, and still get a lot wrong or a lot left out, because I can analyze it again a year from now and find out that I now am able to go much deeper into it than before, or I can look at it much more comprehensively than I did before. So it's not as if you analyze something using the elements of reasoning, and then you're done for all time. Very often you have to go back into asking yourself, okay, so I said what my purpose is, but maybe I have some other purpose, or maybe that purpose is really a blind for some other underlying agenda I have. I might question it later, or I might say, I identified this or that assumption, but there's another assumption I'm making that underlies that as well. And I hadn't thought about that one before. Those, I think, hinge primarily on those two standards, depth and breadth or comprehensiveness. Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to add anything. I think this has been a very enlightening, at least for me, discussion.
Yeah.
And we covered a lot of ground, and we haven't talked much about the elements of reasoning, because we're going to be unpacking that in this series, each of the elements of reasoning in this series. And yet it's again important to focus on the elements in relationship to intellectual standards, which we've been discussing, and then we can't forget intellectual virtues either. So we're using the entire toolbox, including the barriers of egocentric and sociocentric thinking, help us see where we've got an ulterior motive, which is the purpose underneath, the real purpose underneath the purpose we're pretending. So it can look easy. Oh yeah, okay, so here's my purpose, here's my question, here's my information. Wait a minute, well, what's under the purpose? What's the real purpose?
Right.
You aren't willing to battle your irrational forces within you. You're going to always think that your thinking is perfectly fine, and you'll use the tools of critical thinking to prove it. So
that's right.
So you'll be able to say, of course, my purpose is justifiable, and of course, I've been through the elements, and I've as one person I heard who really knew almost nothing about critical thinking said, but he thought that he knew a lot. He said, yeah, we've been studying critical thinking long enough to know how to salt and pepper it in.
Wow.
So that is to misunderstand.
Yeah.
So we want to weave, I guess what I'm thinking of now, and thinking of the analysis of our primary theory. So we have the elements of reasoning. That's one theoretical set we're focusing on now. We have intellectual standards, which must come with the elements of reasoning to get the critical in the reasoning. And then you have intellectual virtues, which are characteristics that we are trying to achieve. And it's through using the elements and the standards well that we do achieve these intellectual virtues, but then we can come at intellectual virtues directly as well in terms of development. And so as we develop our understanding of critical thinking, what I'm saying is, for me, what we want is a mental map. What I want is a map in my mind of concepts that I can rely on, that I can pull from, and that are there for me, and that I use ultimately intuitively whenever I need to, and whenever doing so will enhance my life, such as using different spices in your cooking tonight.
Well, let me say something about the standards and how they enter that. I just liked your example about what other purpose is there. So suppose I'm analyzing my place at my job, and I could go around the circle and actually meet many of the standards and still not have done very much thinking at all. So I can say my goal is is to make the office work better. An assumption I make is that if I always say yes to what my boss says, I will make the office work better. And I can be precise because I can now illuminate the various ways in which I can say yes to what my boss says to do. I can say an implication of this is that I'll advance in the company. And so notice everything I've said is accurate as far as it goes, and it might be clear and it's relevant to my purpose. And yet I've missed the whole dimension of what it is I'm trying to, what it is I might be doing, or in a fuller sense, what I might be doing. I'm thinking of things like making the world a better place. So the barriers and the traits, notice in the analysis I just gave, the barriers are right there. I mean, they're preventing me from getting to anything deep or rich. And the traits, I'm not embodying the traits at all. I'm not showing intellectual humility. I'm not showing intellectual courage. I'm not showing intellectual integrity. So it shows how deceptive it can be, in that I can actually go around the circle of elements and check off some of those standards and say, I'm doing a great job. I'm doing a good job. In fact, I think that there are some politicians, whom I won't name, who regularly reflect on what they have done and say, I've done a really good job. My ego wasn't entering in it at all. And just massive self-deception.
So that's interesting. Yes. And here's another example of that, which is, I think, very intuitive. So parenting. So you can say, what kind of a parent is so-and-so person? So you could say, well, let's say, what kind of parent are you? And you can say, I can say, well, I'm actually a very good parent. And then, because you're thinking that in your mind, you're thinking, well, about 90% of the time, I'm a very good parent. So that makes me a very good parent. But what if 10% of the time I'm a terrible parent? Right. I'm awful.
Yeah.
You know, I yell at my kids, I threaten them, I maybe, hit them, I'm completely out of my mind. So, but in my mind, that's only happening 10% of the time. In fact, let's say, and so 90%, I'm great. And I think that's the way we kind of do think of parenting. Basically, I'm pretty good at it.
That's a really nice example. I mean, I'm a really good person 90% of the time, but of course, 10% of the time I'm an axe murderer. But gee, that's only 10%. Even only 1% of the time.
Maybe that's a good
note on which to end.
Yes, the axe murderer. Yeah, I think that it is, because we will need to get into a discussion about self-deception.
Yeah.
And that will be another discussion. And but this has been very interesting. And as always, our minds are expanded when we just take a little time to explore ideas and to keep sort of at it. Do we really have a handle on analysis now? Do we really see how the elements of reasoning almost always is there when we're analyzing anything, if not always? But maybe we're not highlighting it exactly in terms of the purpose, question, information, etc. So, but in exploring that, and I want to stress the importance of this kind of thinking and this kind of just exploratory discussion, where you don't come in at the beginning with everything figured out.
Right.
You basically have your terrain. You've done your homework, but you haven't thought it all through before talking to someone else that will be able to help you in your thinking. So I've enjoyed this, Gerald. It's always
me too, Linda. Very much.
So we'll see you next time.
Okay.
Take care.
See everybody.